This is a recording for patients starting and adjusting the dose of Parnate. This is all about what dose of Parnate to start and how quickly to adjust it to get the optimum result. Many people, including doctors, seem to get a bit confused about how best to start and adjust the dose of Parnate. As some people who've read my scientific papers and what's on the website may already know, I espouse a technique which is not really in the literature, and that is the technique based on observing the alterations in blood pressure that are caused by drugs like all MAOIs, but Parnate included. The literature is very poor on this. I won't explain why. There's lots about it on the website that people who are interested can read. But in simple, practical terms, let's get straight into what do you do. Well, first of all, the dose range that's adequate, successful, for a great majority of people who take Parnate is between 30 and 50 milligrams daily. A small proportion of people will get a result with only 20, and some people need more than 50. A lot of people in North America especially seem to give rather large doses of Parnate. I'll just very briefly talk about that because I think a lot of those patients are patients who've got very unusual illnesses. What I'm talking about is using tranclypromine Parnate as a standard, very effective treatment for biological depression, for what we used to call endogenous depression, what now perhaps some people would start again to call melancholic depression. So, if you've got that sort of depression, the best way to start Parnate is with a dose of between 10 and 20 milligrams a day. I would start with 10 milligrams a day in people who've got other sorts of illnesses, who are not very well in themselves, who are underweight, very old, whatever. For the average healthy adult, you can start with 20 milligrams a day. The timing of the dose of Parnate is pretty simple. Essentially, it doesn't matter for its effectiveness when you take it, or whether you split the dosage up or not. It only matters depending on how it suits individual people and the side effects that it does or doesn't cause. It's probably wise to start off by taking it in split doses, one first thing in the morning and one 3 to 4 hours later. And when I say first thing in the morning, that can be before you get out of bed in the morning on an empty stomach. Bang, just take it. And then, depending on what time you wake and all the rest of it, you're going to be taking the second one in the mid to late morning or possibly even nearer lunchtime. It doesn't matter exactly. The duration of action of Parnate itself in the system's only a couple of hours or so, and then it drops away fairly quickly. But because it's an irreversible inhibitor, once a molecule of Parnate has locked on to a molecule of this monoamine oxidase, that's the end of the game. That molecule of monoamine oxidase is taken out permanently. And you only replace monoamine oxidase after you've taken an irreversible drug like tranclypromine by producing new enzyme from your genetic code, and that takes place quite slowly. So, start off by taking one first thing in the morning and one roughly 3 hours later. As you increase the dose, it's usually best to start to take the larger part of the dose first thing and the smaller part of the dose later. And that's because one of the commonest problems with Parnate is impairing nighttime sleeping. But the earlier in the day you take it, for a lot of people at least, the less of a problem like that it causes. So some people, for that reason, take the whole dose first thing in the morning. The reason not everybody does that is because some people find if they do that, it causes more side effects, particularly this transient increase in blood pressure for an hour or so after a dose, especially a larger dose. Okay, so that's the timing of the doses. Now, how do you decide how quickly to increase it? Well, that's where the blood pressure business comes in. And an inevitable therapeutic effect of monoamine oxidase inhibitors is that they reduce blood pressure. Everybody goes on about increased blood pressure, and I'm sure there are a lot of doctors who think these drugs increase blood pressure. They don't. They decrease it. Indeed, these drugs were actually used back in the 1960s for treating people with hypertension, high blood pressure. And you can use that effect because it's not really a side effect, it's part of the way the drug works. And so most people get that effect to a quite noticeable degree. Some people get it to a degree that it's problematic and it makes it difficult for them to take an adequate dose to get the optimal response. But because blood pressure is part of the way the drug works, if your blood pressure's dropping, what that almost inevitably indicates is that the level has reached the level in the system required to act as a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and therefore you'd expect it to work as an antidepressant. Now, obviously, there are lots of different mechanisms that control blood pressure, so that's not always true in everybody, because some people are naturally very prone to low blood pressure, etc., etc. So, as with all of these kinds of things, there's quite a lot of variation from person to person. But basically, it's an inevitable effect of the drug, and if you monitor carefully the blood pressure, then you will get quite a good indication of whether or not it's at an effective level, and also, of course, whether or not it's safe to increase it more or less quickly. So the way you do your blood pressure is you do your sitting and standing blood pressure, because the main change with these drugs is causing a drop in blood pressure immediately after you stand up. Postural hypotension is the phrase that's often used to describe it. So a drop in blood pressure on standing. Nowadays, I recommend people get themselves their own blood pressure machine and monitor at home. Most doctors don't do it properly in the office, and in any case, your blood pressure isn't very representative of how it normally is when you're in a doctor's office. It's often quite different in that situation to what it is when you're just at home. Blood pressure normally varies quite a lot from minute to minute and hour to hour. So it is useful to try to make sure, as far as it's practical and possible, to be sitting quietly for 5 minutes before you do your blood pressure. And then you measure your blood pressure. You can use a wrist machine or a machine that goes around your upper arm. It doesn't matter. They're all adequately accurate for this purpose. And you measure your blood pressure sitting down, and then you stand up, and almost all these machines, as far as I know now, are just automatic. You press a button, the little motor pumps it up, that's it. So what you do is you press the button, immediately you stand up. And by the time the machine has done the first reading, and you've sort of written it down or whatever, and pressed the button again, by the time the second reading is actually finishing and measuring your blood pressure, that'll be about a minute after you've actually stood up. And that works very well because, as you'll see if you look at the website, there's a document there that shows a graph of what typically happens to people's blood pressure as they increase the dose. And so you could perhaps download that and look at it whilst you're listening to me speaking. So what typically happens with a small dose, like 20 or 30 milligrams, is you might get just a little bit of a drop in blood pressure, like 5 or 10 millimeters of mercury. And I'm just talking about the systolic, the peak reading. You don't need to worry about the second reading. So highest is systolic and the lowest is diastolic. So, 120 over 70, as doctors usually say, or whatever. So we're just talking about the systolic, the peak reading. So that might drop by 5 or 10 millimeters of mercury. But the second reading, immediately it'll be back up to what it was before, possibly even a little bit higher. Because most people, in fact, when they stand up, the blood pressure is slightly higher than it is when they're sitting, because the system perhaps slightly overcompensates. If you stayed on that dose for 5 to 10 days, that drop would disappear completely in almost everybody. If you increase it, which if there was only a tiny drop, after 4 or 5 days, it would be sensible to increase it from 20 to 30, then you will almost certainly get a slightly bigger drop in blood pressure. And what you're aiming for, and look at the graph, is the second reading to be lower than the first reading. So once the stuff really starts to work properly, you probably get a 10 millimeter drop immediately, and then when you've been standing up for a minute, it might be 15 or 20 millimeters lower. So instead of being 120, it might drop right down to 100. Now, if you kept on and measured it after 2 minutes and then another 5 minutes standing up, you might well find it had come back up again. So we're just talking about the immediate measurement and then the second one that's after about a minute. So it's those measurements which give you a very good guide as to whether or not to increase it. Now, very occasionally, you find somebody who gets quite a big drop on only 20 milligrams. Now, because if your blood pressure drops a lot, like most people whose blood pressure drops below 80 will feel faint, you might get buzzing in the ears, vision goes funny, wallop, hit the floor. Now, obviously you don't want that to happen because you might hurt yourself. So it's very important to understand that the drop in blood pressure can occasionally come on quite quickly and be enough to make you fall over and faint. So you want to make sure that if you feel like that, you sit down quickly, because of course the moment you sit down or lie down, your blood pressure will be okay. But that's not a problem, but it's important to be aware of it. And if your blood pressure is dropping to that extent on a low dose like 20 milligrams, then that means, of course, you've got to give your system plenty of time to adjust to that dose. And it also indicates, as I averred to before, that that might be a big enough dose for you because it's blocking MAO enough to give you that big drop in blood pressure. And I've certainly seen a lot of people whose doctors have hurried them on to taking 40 or 50 milligrams a day, perhaps too quickly, when they probably would have got a perfectly adequate response to a lower dose. And as with any drug, you don't want to take a larger dose than is necessary to get the desired effect. If you take excessive doses, you just on a lose-lose situation where you get more side effects but little or no extra benefit. So there you are. Slow and steady wins the race, but not too slow. So the adjustment of the blood pressure that I mentioned earlier, that occurs over a period of 5 to 10 days. It'll go on for longer than that, but most of the adjustment that you see is going to occur in that time period. So let's say you got to 30 milligrams and your blood pressure was dropping by 20 or 30 millimeters of mercury, and you had even felt a little bit faint occasionally. Well, what I would say then is, well, it's working pretty well. It might well be that 30 is enough for you, and the thing to do is to stick with that for 2 to 3 weeks. Now, 2 to 3 weeks, if it's an adequate level to do something, is almost certainly enough time to develop a clear and definite indication of whether the drug's doing any good. So, and over that time, of course, you'll be able to judge to what extent the body's adjusting to that low blood pressure and how much, if any, problem it might be. Now, for people who need more like 50 milligrams than 30, then those steps can be repeated with 30 to 40 milligrams and 40 to 50 milligrams. So again, if you were taking 40 milligrams and getting very little drop in blood pressure and very little improvement after you've been taking that for a couple of weeks, or virtually no improvement, then I would say yes, go on up to 50. But once you get to 50, because that's enough for a large proportion of people, I would say probably 95% of people with depression. I'm not talking specifically here about difficult or treatment-resistant depression. I'm just talking about typical melancholic depression, which is not difficult to treat. Not with Parnate, anyway. So with those sorts of people, I would say stick with a dose of no more than 50 for a properly adequate time to make a really confident judgment about whether it is or isn't helping. And by that I mean 6 to 8 weeks. But if after that time it's definitely not producing an effect, then it would be reasonable after consideration, etc., to consider a higher dose. And sometimes when you increase the dose a bit higher than that, people will suddenly start getting quite a definite drop in blood pressure, even though they didn't at a lower dose. All right, I think that's a fairly good starting guide to how to adjust the dose. And obviously, if there are problems, you can speak with your doctor about those if he's reasonably experienced in using drugs like this. But if you and your doctor are stuck, then of course you can send questions to me on the website, or even contact me via Skype or whatever. So there you are. It's not that difficult. It just requires a little logic and a little care and systematic adjustment. If you have found this podcast useful, and it's a good way for you to get information about the sorts of things that are on my website, then do sign up so that we can automatically send you notifications of the new podcasts